Shabbat Shalom. We read this morning about an interchange between Jacob and Rachel, the two lovers in this week's Torah portion, where we see a different side of their relationship. Rachel says to her husband, says to Jacob, "Give me children or give me death." And Jacob's response, the Torah says, "Vayichar af," that Jacob is infuriated with her and says, "Am I God who has prevented you from having a child?" Now, it's been a while since I took health class, but my understanding of biology is that presumably has some role in this. But I suppose he can actually say, "Look, I'm having children with Leah, so whatever this is, it's not about me, it's about you." But looking outside the practicalities of that exchange, these are two people who are love at first sight, who yearn for each other, who pine for each other. He works for 7 years and another 7 to take her as wife. And yet, at a moment of vulnerability, he responds with rage, with anger. And I want to reflect. When you zoom out on this portion, you see similar things happen. So Rachel and Leah are sisters, and yet there is bickering between them. You see how they respond to each other, how they respond to their father, Laban, and you see family relationships disrupted, torn apart. You see conflict. And I think part of what is happening here is, on a very narrow level, we could say that Jacob is simply unconcerned about what is happening with Rachel. So there's the old story of the guy who comes to the doctor, and the doctor says, "You have some test numbers that seem off, but I wouldn't worry about it." And the guy says, "Look, if you had test numbers that were off, I also wouldn't be worried about it." But in this case, I think there's actually something different happening, which is that Jacob and Rachel are in this pressure cooker. They know that they are living in the household of Laban, who has deceived them, has betrayed them, who is looking for an opportunity and an excuse to undo whatever they have done. And in the face of that external pressure, they crack and they turn on each other. In the face of drama that is the lack of a child, a father-in-law who behaves deceitfully, they direct their discomfort, they redirect their rage, their anger upon each other. And I think at this moment in time, that those experiences are ones that we should keep in mind. I have had teachers who have talked about the idea of compassion fatigue, that you can only care about a thing, a situation for so long, that you can only carry so much in your heart at any one time. And the idea that over time we become hardened, or that even more so that if we have an anger, if we have an emotion that we cannot focus in one direction, it comes out in others. And so this is definitely a time of, for many of us, compassion fatigue. This is a time for many of us of just simply running out of places for emotions to go. So I was reflecting back recently on the first 2 months of COVID, actually rather fondly. I mean, they were pretty terrible, but I didn't have to go anywhere, I didn't have to do anything. I'd put on pants like once a week. And everyone in the world kind of understood it's a pandemic, nothing is happening, the world is abnormal. Everyone gave each other a little bit of grace. We live in a world where our Jewish people, where Israel, we are under threat in a million different ways, and yet life continues. right? And yet there are weddings, there are bar mitzvahs, there are obligations at work, right? Quarterly tax statements are due, right? Everything continues to happen unabated while this is going on, while life for many of us is frozen, the world continues to move. And so I'm reflecting on the stress that brings about. In particular, a number of you forwarded me an article by a rabbi who made a fuss that he was storming out of the conservative movement because it was not pro-Israel enough. And so you can go look up the article if you want. And I will say, so this is a rabbi who I've known for a long time, and he is brilliant. He could take the 6 answers on the back of a Trivial Pursuit card and make them an argument for Zionism. I believe in Israel because of Jim Thorpe, the Bessemer Process, 1973, and the Munsters. Go. And so he, in this article, does a similar sort of sleight of hand. He sort of has 4 points. One is that he grew up in the conservative movement. 2, there's an organization called Torah that he says hates Israel. 3, someone on a confidential rabbi's listserv said that Israel was committing genocide. 4, I love Israel, and I am deeply concerned about my family members who are on the front lines, are in danger every day defending it. So let me break apart that argument for you and show you where it is entirely correct and where it breaks down. So part 1, absolutely true. Rabbi Gordis and I both have, our grandfathers actually ran together in the heyday of the conservative movement, the 30s, 40s, and 50s, writing books, giving lectures, eating fish, broiled fish in non-kosher restaurants, all the things that conservative rabbis did back then. And there's some inside baseball here for some of our colleagues who are here. And so you could actually say, if you know the term, we are Nepo babies of the conservative movement. And, you know, whenever you grow up in something, you see its faults as much as its blessings. There's a discussion, the commentary in the book of Exodus, when Moses is bringing the plagues, any of the plagues that involve the Nile or the dust of the earth, Aaron does. And the reason is God says to him, don't throw a stone in the well from which you drank. The Nile, you floated down the Nile safely, don't curse it with blood. The earth covered over the Egyptian who you killed, don't curse the earth, even if it is the earth of Egypt. So growing up in something, one has more intense feelings than perhaps if it's something that you came to. If it's something that's in your blood, you feel it strongly. Step 2, he makes the claim that there's an organization called Torah that hates Israel. I have to say, I am not really fond of Torah. It's a social justice organization, and I actually happen to think they're wrong about a lot of things, but I do happen to think that they really care about Israel, even if it's not in the same way that I do, right? So their leaders are at the pro-Israel rallies, have gone to Israel to show support, and, you know, anyone can take a fraction, a paragraph of an article on a website and turn it into whatever they want, right? If I take a small enough quote from anyone and put it in a blender, I can make it say all kinds of things. Point 3, made the claim that someone on a confidential rabbinical assembly listserv accused Israel of genocide. So I will say to you, one of the things that I do for my mental health is that I do not read RavNet. You will never find a more wretched hub of you never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy, if you will. But so I have, in addition to the 60,000 or so unread emails that I have that are work related, I have another 100,000 unread emails just from RavNet, which I will someday get to, definitely. No, I'm holding on to those. But in general, it is a place where rabbis with too much time on their hands fight with each other because they can't say those kinds of things to the people in their congregations. And I took the time to review, and the rabbi on the listserv didn't say what he said, and that's all I'm going to say, because it is confidential. And when I first read this article, I myself was enraged. And I actually wrote a response, which in my wisdom I did not send. I also know how to turn a phrase, because I realized that the only part of this article that really mattered was point 4. That this is a person who is in pain, who is in rage, who is in fear, because his children are on the front lines and making sacrifices that most of us here don't understand. And he has grandchildren who he is afraid may not grow up knowing their parents because of what's happening at this moment. And so I have to offer him grace, because that is what the experience is that he is going through. And so I have to disagree with him. I have to explain why point 1, 2, and 3 do not add up to 4. But nevertheless, to understand that this is just an example of a phenomenon that many of us are experiencing in large and small ways. When we are under pressure, we lash out at who is nearest, right? Because I can't send an email telling Hamas that I quit my relationship with them. And I see this happening in so many scales. Right at the end of COVID, there was this burst of divorces in the congregation because all these people realized, wait, who have I been living with all this time? And in the last couple of weeks, I have never had this many couples have relationships fall apart in the congregation as in the last 7 weeks. And it's not just the only explanation I have, you guys are okay, thank God, right? But that when there is external pressure, we crack within ourselves, within our families, within our communities. So I know many of us are celebrating, as I am, that 13 of the over 200 hostages were released by Hamas. There are more who are coming. I will not be happy until they are all home. But I want to point out that part of why Hamas, amongst the instructions that they gave those who they sent to kill, to murder, to rape, was to take captives, because they know the greatest pressure they can place on Israel, the greatest wedge that they can offer, is because there is nothing that is a greater pressure on the Israeli government than families of those who are being held hostage standing inside the Knesset. And they know that if they had killed those people, it would not have had nearly the same impact as it does by holding them alive. So I read that Jonathan Pollard actually came out against the families of the hostages, saying, look, I was in jail for 30 years, and you know what? No one got me out, so why should you have anything different? But basically saying, look, from where I sit, one person or even 200 people are not worth the state of Israel. I am not in a position to argue with either Jonathan Pollard or the families of those held, but I want to point out that what was going on here, this is a conflict that is fomented externally. This is exactly the break within our people that Hamas is trying to create. So Golda Meir is quoted as saying, when peace comes, we will perhaps in time be able to forgive the Arabs for killing our sons, but it will be harder for us to forgive them for having forced us to kill their sons. Peace will come when the Arabs will love their children more than they hate us. So if you read the Gordis letter carefully, part of what he is saying is that he is critical of those who have empathy for people on the other side. And I have to say, I can appreciate that there is this continuum from Stockholm syndrome to reason to racism, and it's hard to find our place in between. So at the moment, I care about Palestinian casualties because I think any ethical person has to care about the death of any human being or any innocent human being. But at the moment, that is lower on my list of concerns than my care for my own people who are under fire, because I know that the reason they are dying is that Hamas cares more for casualties on both sides, because that is how it wins. And so it is very easy to fall into a trap of having one's empathy misdirected and say, oh, woe isn't to them, and who cares what happens to us? It's also easy to fall into the trap that says, who cares what happens to them? The only thing that matters is us. And so when I burn with a desire for justice against those who murdered and raped, and when I burn with passion for the moral right and the obligation that Israel's defense forces have to protect Jewish children, even if it is at the expense of the lives of the children of those who are trying to kill them, I have to be careful that I don't let that turn into a desire for revenge. The death of the enemy is regrettable, but sometimes necessary. I get scared when we consider the death of the enemy to be glorious. And so what do we do in this moment? Rachel and Leah have this war between them. They know that their father Laban is up to no good. He says, surely now he regards us as outsiders, and he has used up our purchase price. And yet Rachel and Leah, even though their father seeks to drive a wedge between them, we see are able to offer each other a moment of grace. So one of the questions that I like to ask is, how was it that Jacob was fooled? How was it he wakes up, whoa, it's Leah! How'd that happen, right? Dude, weren't you with her all? Like, hold on a minute. Like, how'd you make that mistake? And so one answer is that in those days, men and women did not have a lot of contact, right? If you've only met someone once or twice, if you haven't seen someone, right, in 2 years, 7 years, kind of looks like them. Or maybe they were twins, right? They were almost identical twins. Another explanation is that actually all the townspeople were in on it, that all of the people of the place were sort of gaslighting Jacob. Well, of course it's Rachel. But my favorite answer is that Rachel and Leah suspected that this might happen, and that even though Rachel had given Jacob signs to know that it was her, at the last moment she caved and she gave Leah the password, so to speak, the secret language, so that she would be able to pass as her sister, so that her sister would not be embarrassed. So that even though there were those on the outside seeking to drive a wedge, that Rachel gave grace to her sister in that moment to say, we will not let our father split us apart. And so we live in a time where there are many who seek to drive a wedge between us, whether because that is explicitly their goal by their actions or simply by virtue of the pressure that we are under. And so it is at moments like these that we especially need to realize, to hold ourselves, to realize the moments when we are short on grace, the moments when we are short on compassion, the moments where we are short on patience, and to make sure that our rage is directed appropriately, that when we lash out, it is not at those near, but at those far. That we recognize that when we are angry, that someone has not done something that we want in exactly the way we want it, that doesn't make them the enemy, that maybe makes them an imperfect ally. And so in this Shabbat, as we are 7 weeks in to a conflict which I think may last not just 7, our portion says sometimes 7 becomes another 7. If we are done in 7 weeks, we should count ourselves as lucky. That as we go through a period of continued pressure and anger and stress, that we remember to have passion and compassion for each other. That we remember that the nature of our Jewish people is to have mercy first and foremost upon ourselves and upon each other. And to remember that in order to say Am Yisrael Chai, we need to be an Am. In order to say the nation of Israel lives, we have to see ourselves as a single nation, and only then can we survive. Shabbat Shalom.